My name is Hannah. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe with soft words. Steady, reasonable, easy to work with. I've been a wife, a professional, the person who remembers birthdays, keeps receipts, smooths over awkward silences. If you passed me in a grocery store, you wouldn't look twice, and that's kind of the point. I've learned that when you don't demand attention, people tend to project their assumptions onto you. They decide who you are before you ever speak. Most people assumed I was agreeable because I didn't raise my voice. They assumed I was simple because I didn't argue every point. They assumed I was dependent because I trusted the man I married. None of those assumptions felt dangerous at the time. They felt convenient for everyone else. This is not a story about revenge. It's not about proving someone wrong in a dramatic way or exposing secrets for applause. It's about something quieter and honestly more unsettling. What happens when trust collapses without warning and the person you thought knew you best seizes the system to remove you from your own life? The day my husband filed a restraining order against me didn't start with shouting or threats. It started with a question, a calm one. I asked about the money that didn't add up. Money that had quietly gone missing. Within days, I was removed from my own home with one bag. No time to explain, no chance to prepare, just a decision made somewhere else and enforced with paperwork and silence. What follows is not a play-by-play of court documents or legal jargon. It's the emotional geography of what that kind of removal does to you. How does disorientation feel in the body? How quickly your identity can be rewritten by other people's narratives, and how power doesn't always announce itself loudly. It often hides behind politeness, procedure, and the assumption that you won't push back. I'm telling this story because I've noticed how often quiet people are misunderstood in moments of conflict. Silence is mistaken for weakness. Calm is mistaken for compliance. And when systems are involved, legal, financial, social, the person who speaks first is often believed, while the person who pauses is treated as suspicious. There are no heroes or villains here in the cartoon sense, just choices. Some made out of fear, some are out of control, and some out of a very clear understanding of timing. I won't exaggerate what happened, and I won't minimize it either. I'm not here to ask for sympathy, only attention, the kind that listens without rushing to judgment. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't perform your pain loudly enough, you might recognize parts of yourself in this. So before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, too late, that staying calm made people assume you would stay silent forever? To most people around us, I was the reasonable one. That's what they said when my husband forgot something important, and I quietly handled it. That's what they said when plans changed at the last minute, and I adapted without complaint. Hannah's easy, they'd say, smiling like it was a compliment. Easy to live with, easy to work around, easy to overlook. In our marriage, I had a role that was never formally assigned, but constantly reinforced. I managed the logistics of our life, bills, calendars, the rhythm of normalcy. I didn't announce what I did because it didn't feel like power. It felt like responsibility. And responsibility, when performed quietly, becomes invisible. My husband was seen as the driver, the decision maker, the one with the vision. People asked him questions about our future while I stood next to him, nodding, already calculating what those decisions would require behind the scenes. I wasn't resentful, at least not consciously. I told myself this was a partnership, different strengths, different lanes. When friends talked about finances, they looked at him. When the family discussed long-term plans, they deferred to him. I noticed that when I spoke, people listened politely, but when he spoke, they took notes. Over time, that dynamic settled into something fixed. Not hostile, just assumed. I became the person who didn't need things explained, the person who would understand, the person who wouldn't make it awkward by asking too many questions. And because I didn't challenge that framing, it hardened. What's strange is that invisibility doesn't feel like a full erasure at first. It feels like peace. Fewer arguments, less friction. You start to believe that harmony is proof you're doing something right. I told myself that not everything needed to be discussed, that trust meant letting go of control, that love meant choosing calm over conflict. I didn't see how often that calm only flowed in one direction. In public, I was the supportive wife. In private, I was the stabilizer, the one who noticed when something was off, but waited for the right time to mention it, the one who absorbed uncertainty quietly. I kept notes, not because I was suspicious, but because I was organized. That's what I told myself. Dates, numbers, small inconsistencies that didn't rise to the level of alarm, but didn't fully disappear either. If anyone had asked me then who I was in my marriage, I would have said I was trusted, included, safe. But trust, I learned later, can be asymmetric. People trusted me to cope, to adapt, to not escalate. They trusted that I wouldn't disrupt the narrative they were comfortable with, and I trusted that being steady meant being secure. No one warned me that the very traits people praised, my patience, my restraint, my tendency to observe instead of react, were also traits that made it easier to speak for me. When decisions were made, they were framed as practical. When information was withheld, it was framed as protecting me from stress. When I didn't object, it was taken as agreement. I was present but not consulted, included but not informed. And because nothing was overtly cruel, I didn't name it as a problem. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. Just a slow accumulation of being useful instead of being equal. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my silhouette was to everyone else. Reliable, calm, low maintenance, someone who would adjust. What no one seemed curious about was what I noticed, or remembered, or quietly held on to. Because when you are underestimated long enough, people stop hiding things from you, not out of confidence, but out of habit. And I was watching, not angrily, not scheming, just paying attention. At the time, I thought that made me passive. I didn't yet understand that it was positioning. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as a pause. A moment where a number didn't line up, and my mind didn't immediately smooth it over the way it usually did. It was something small, a transfer I didn't recognize. Not large enough to trigger panic, not frequent enough to look like a pattern. Just unfamiliar. I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary, waiting for recognition to click into place. It didn't. When I asked about it, I didn't accuse. I didn't even sound concerned. I asked the way someone asks about the weather. Curious, neutral, open to being corrected. "Oh, that?" he said. "It's nothing, just temporary." That should have been the end of it. And on the surface, it was. He spoke with the confidence of someone used to being believed, and I nodded with the reflex of someone used to accommodating. But something in his tone lingered, not defensiveness, efficiency, as if the question itself was unnecessary. Later, when I mentioned it again, carefully, almost apologetically, he laughed, not unkindly, more like someone amused by a misunderstanding. "You don't need to worry about that stuff," he said. "I've got it handled." The room didn't change. The conversation didn't escalate, but something shifted quietly inside me. Not fear, not anger, awareness. Because trust, I realized, isn't just about believing someone. It's about being allowed to understand. I told myself I was overthinking it. Everyone has their own way of managing money. We had never set strict boundaries around who tracked what. I'd agreed to that dynamic early on, back when it felt efficient instead of exclusionary. So I let it go, but I didn't forget it. Over the next few weeks, there were more moments like that. Brief, almost forgettable. A bill was already paid when I went to check. A statement I didn't recognize. Each time the explanation came easily. Too easily. Always calm, always final. And each time I noticed how quickly the conversation was closed. When I tried to slow it down, just to understand, he framed my questions as worry, as stress, as something he was sparing me from. "You trust me, right?" he asked once lightly. I said yes. Because I did. Or because I wanted to. Or because saying no felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. What surprised me most was how everyone else reacted when these moments surfaced in conversation. If I mentioned, casually, that I wasn't fully clear on our finances, friends smiled sympathetically. "That's just how marriages work," one said. One person handles it. Better not to micromanage, another joked. No one heard the hesitation in my voice. Or maybe they heard it and decided it didn't matter. So I adjusted. I asked fewer questions. I told myself clarity wasn't always necessary. That piece was worth a little ambiguity. But ambiguity, when repeated, becomes a kind of erosion. I started keeping track, not in a dramatic way. No hidden folders, no confrontational spreadsheets, just notes in my notebook. Dates, amounts, context. Not because I planned to use them, just because I didn't want to gaslight myself into forgetting what I'd seen. That was the first cut. Not the missing money itself, but the subtle message that my curiosity was inconvenient, that my role was to accept reassurance, not request transparency. It didn't bleed, no one noticed, but it changed the way I stood in the relationship. A slight inward lean, a recalibration. I didn't confront it because it didn't feel confrontational. It felt educational, like learning a boundary I hadn't known existed. And once you learn where the boundaries are, you start to see how often you're expected to stay on one side of them. Disrespect doesn't usually announce itself. It doesn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. More often, it arrives dressed as efficiency, as reassurance, as someone else deciding what you don't need to know. After that first small cut, the pattern didn't escalate dramatically. It settled, it became routine. And routines, when they don't hurt outright, are easy to excuse. When I asked questions, the answers were shorter. When I followed up, the tone shifted. Still calm, but firmer, like a conversation that needed to end. I learned which topics produced that subtle tightening in his jaw, the one that signaled impatience masked as composure. Money became one of those topics. So I adapted. I told myself that marriages thrive on division of labor, that his confidence meant I could rest, that my discomfort was just a byproduct of not being in control. And hadn't I always prided myself on not needing control? Every time I chose silence, it felt rational, mature even. I didn't want to become suspicious. I didn't want to erode trust by acting like an auditor instead of a partner. So I normalized what bothered me by reframing it as my own insecurity. That's how it works. You internalize the imbalance until it feels like a personality flaw instead of a structural one. The strange thing is, the more I stepped back, the more decisions were made without me. Not out of secrecy, out of assumption. Assumption that I didn't want the details. Assumption that I'd be fine with the outcome. And I was, mostly. Life continued. We hosted dinners, we planned trips. We talked about the future in broad, comforting strokes. If there were gaps in the information I had, they were filled with trust, or at least the appearance of it. But my notebook grew heavier, not with accusations, with observations, patterns, a quiet chronology of moments that felt small on their own, but heavy in aggregate. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't even fully admit to myself what I was doing. I just knew that forgetting felt wrong. What made it easier to stay quiet was how everyone else reinforced the dynamic. People praised our balance. They admired how unbothered I seemed, how I didn't nag, how I let things go. It was said with admiration, but admiration can be a trap. It rewards you for staying in a shape that benefits others. When I did express mild concern, never framed as an accusation, it was met with immediate reassurance, almost too immediate, as if the goal wasn't understanding, but containment. "You're overthinking," he'd say gently. "Everything's fine," with a smile. "Why stress about hypotheticals?" And I'd nod, because I didn't have proof, only discomfort. And discomfort, when you can't articulate it cleanly, feels like a weak foundation for conflict. So I normalized it. I told myself that not all questions need answers, that love doesn't require full visibility. I was lucky to be with someone who handled things. What I didn't realize then was that by accepting partial information as normal, I was also accepting partial agency. I stopped asking, not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of being made to feel like caring was unnecessary. Silence became a coping mechanism, a way to preserve harmony, a way to avoid becoming difficult. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my expectations adjusted downward. Transparency became optional. Inclusion became conditional. This is the quietest kind of disrespect, the kind that trains you to collaborate in your own exclusion. By the time I noticed how far the line had moved, it no longer felt shocking. It felt familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It convinces you that things have always been this way, even when they haven't. I didn't feel angry. I felt contained, like a presence in my own life rather than a participant. At the time, I thought my silence was patience. I hadn't yet seen that patience, when consistently one-sided becomes permission. It wasn't one conversation that made me understand my role. It was the accumulation of glances, tones, and assumptions that revealed it to me fully formed, like something that had existed long before I noticed it. I was the reliable one, not the visionary, not the decider. The reliable one. The person who would adjust her expectations to fit the moment. The person who would absorb inconvenience quietly and translate chaos into order without needing recognition. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee how consistently that role showed up everywhere. In social settings, I was the one people handed tasks to without asking, "Can you keep track of this? Can you remind him about that?" It was never framed as exploitation. It was framed as trust. And because I delivered, every time the expectation solidified. In my marriage, that reliability became the foundation others stood on while I remained unseen. Decisions were made with the assumption that I would adapt. Plans were altered with the expectation that I would understand. Information was filtered with the belief that I didn't need all of it. I didn't resist because the role came with a strange kind of safety. When you are useful, people want to keep you around. When you are predictable, you are rarely confronted. But usefulness is not the same as respect. The clearest realization came during a conversation that wasn't about me at all. We were with friends, talking about a major financial decision, one that affected both of us. Everyone looked at him. They asked him what he thought and what the plan was. I was physically there, but conceptually absent. No one asked me how I felt about it, and the most unsettling part? He didn't redirect the question. He answered it alone, confidently, as if that were natural. I smiled, I nodded, I played my part. Later, when I brought it up, carefully without accusation, he seemed genuinely surprised. "I didn't think you'd want to be involved in that level of detail," he said. Not dismissively, almost kindly. That was the moment I understood how completely the role had been internalized. Not just by others, but by him. I wasn't excluded out of malice. I was excluded because I had been categorized. Reliable, low friction, adaptable. Someone who would take care of what followed, not shape what came first. Once you are placed in that category, everything you do is interpreted through it. Your silence becomes consent. Your questions become anomalies. Your discomfort becomes something to manage rather than address. I saw how often my presence was used to legitimize decisions I hadn't participated in. How my calm demeanor made outcomes appear mutual, even when they weren't. And I saw how difficult it would be to challenge that role directly. Because roles, once assigned, come with expectations. Deviating from them feels like betrayal. I didn't want to be seen as ungrateful, or dramatic, or suddenly different, so I stayed the same. On the surface. Internally, something hardened, not into anger but into clarity. I stopped expecting to be invited into conversations that mattered. I stopped assuming transparency would be offered freely. I stopped mistaking comfort for equity. And in that quiet recalibration, I began to see the system as it was. Not cruel, efficient, designed to function smoothly as long as I stayed in position. The irony is that the very qualities that put me in that role, my observation, my patience, my consistency, were also the qualities that allowed me to understand it fully. I didn't confront it yet. I didn't disrupt the balance. I simply stopped believing in it. And that shift, internal and visible, was the first time I felt something like agency returning. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no revelation, no raised voice or slammed door. If you had been watching from a distance, you would have seen an ordinary afternoon unfold exactly as it always did. But internally, it was the day I stopped assuming things would resolve themselves if I stayed calm. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the surface, in that late afternoon way that makes everything look softer than it is. I had my notebook open, not dramatically, not hidden, just open like it often was. I was reconciling numbers the way I always did, more out of habit than urgency. That's when I noticed it. Not a single transaction, but a sequence. Small movements that only formed a shape if you looked at them together. transfers that followed a rhythm, amounts that were just low enough to avoid attention, just frequent enough to matter. For the first time, I didn't immediately reach for an explanation that made me feel unreasonable. I sat with it, and in that stillness, something very quiet happened. I believed myself. I didn't rush to ask him about it. I didn't rehearse how to sound non-confrontational. I didn't tell myself I was probably misunderstanding. I simply acknowledged that what I was seeing was real, and that my discomfort had been trying to tell me something for a long time. The shift wasn't emotional, it was cognitive. I realized I had been approaching every moment from the assumption that clarity would be offered if it were necessary. That trust meant waiting to be included, that if something was wrong, it would announce itself clearly. But this wasn't chaos. It was structured, and structures don't collapse on their own. They persist until someone stops accommodating them. That was the day I stopped framing my silence as patience. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Confrontation wasn't the first move. Awareness was. I started asking different questions, not out loud, but internally. Questions about access, about documentation, about how decisions were justified and who benefited from the lack of scrutiny. I paid attention to how often trust was used as a substitute for transparency, how quickly reassurance replaced explanation, how often my calm had been mistaken for consent. There was a strange relief in that clarity. Not relief that something was wrong, but relief that I no longer needed to convince myself everything was right. That night we had dinner as usual. We talked about ordinary things. He told a story. I listened. But I was listening differently now. Not for tone or emotion, but for alignment, for consistency. And I noticed how often the story skipped details, how comfortable that omission had become. I didn't feel betrayed yet. That came later. What I felt was resolved. Resolved to stop offering unearned trust. Resolved to stop filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. Resolved to let silence become intentional instead of reflexive. This wasn't a plan. It wasn't a strategy in the dramatic sense. It was a recalibration of posture. I understood suddenly that my power had never been taken from me. It had been placed aside gently because I allowed it to be. And I also understood that reclaiming it wouldn't require force. It would require restraint. The day something shifted wasn't visible to anyone else. There was no marker, no announcement, no change in behavior they could point to. But it was the day I stopped waiting to be included. And once that waiting ends, everything that follows moves differently. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before it had been automatic, an instinct shaped by habit and reward. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. From the outside, nothing about me looked different. I still nodded at the right moments. I still asked about his day. I still fulfilled the role everyone expected me to play. That was the brilliance of it. When people believe they understand you, they stop watching closely. What they didn't realize was that my quiet had stopped being passive. I no longer asked questions that would be dismissed. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I understood something new. Questions asked too early are invitations to be managed. Questions asked too often teach others how to hide better. So I waited. I listened without reacting. I noticed what was volunteered and what was consistently absent. I paid attention to how often decisions were framed as already settled by the time I heard about them. Silence gave me space, not emotional distance, but informational clarity. And people filled that space generously. My husband mistook my lack of inquiry for relief. He seemed more relaxed, more confident. The reassurance came less frequently because it wasn't being requested. He talked more freely, assuming the audience was uncritical. That's the paradox of being underestimated. When people believe you aren't tracking the details, they stop guarding them. I began to see the architecture clearly. Which accounts I could view and which I couldn't. Which explanations came prepackaged and which topics were avoided entirely. None of it required confrontation to observe. It only required patience. Others mistook my silence for emotional withdrawal, a phase, stress. They encouraged me to take care of myself, assuming I was overwhelmed. I let them think that, because silence, when chosen consciously, becomes camouflage. I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning. I stopped correcting small inaccuracies in stories he told, not because they didn't matter, but because correcting them would only prompt defensiveness. Instead, I noted them, quietly, chronologically, without judgment. I stopped volunteering, a context that made things easier. I let minor inconveniences land where they belonged. I allowed systems to reveal their pressure points without stepping in to cushion the impact. And still, no drama. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just space. It was in that space that I noticed how often others relied on my emotional labor without realizing it. How much smoothing I had been doing unconsciously. How many small frictions had absorbed to keep everything looking stable. When I stopped doing that work, nothing collapsed immediately. But it shifted. Conversations felt less fluid. Decisions took longer. My absence from certain processes was suddenly noticeable, and still no one asked why. Because when people are used to your silence, they assume it's endless. I also noticed something else. How much more I trusted myself when I wasn't constantly explaining my perspective to someone else. My thoughts felt clearer, less fragmented, less defensive. I wasn't trying to be right anymore. I was trying to be accurate. That distinction mattered. Accuracy doesn't rush. It waits for enough information to exist. And information was accumulating. I didn't feel powerful in a cinematic way. There was no surge of confidence. What I felt was steady, grounded, like standing on solid ground after years of compensating for imbalance. Silence became my boundary, not a wall, but a filter. And in that filtered space, I could finally see what I had been carrying for everyone else, and what I no longer needed to. I understood then why quiet people are often mistaken for weak ones, because restraint looks like absence to those who benefit from your presence. What they never noticed was how much time I had. Not free time, not idle time, but uninterrupted time. Time that wasn't spent defending myself, explaining my feelings, or trying to be understood. Time reclaimed from emotional labor. Silence gave me that. While everyone else assumed nothing had changed, I began doing what I had always done best, only now with intention. I observed systems instead of people, patterns instead of moods, documentation instead of memory. I didn't become paranoid, I became precise. I revisited old records, not looking for a single smoking gun, but for continuity. I compared statements across months. I traced movements the way you'd trace a river, by watching where it narrowed, where it disappeared underground, where it resurfaced somewhere else entirely. What stood out wasn't just what was missing, it was how consistently it was missing in the same way. There is a difference between chaos and design. Chaos is erratic. Design is repeatable. I started separating what I felt from what I could verify. Feelings fluctuate. Verification accumulates. I trusted the accumulation. At the same time, I paid attention to language. Not just what was said, but how responsibility was framed. It's already taken care of. You don't need to worry about that. We'll deal with it later. Each phrase pushed my involvement further into the future, further away from the moment decisions were made. I noted when we meant him, and when it didn't include me at all. I also noticed something subtler. How much of our shared life relied on my compliance rather than my consent. Consent requires information. Compliance only requires silence. And I had been silent for a long time. I began positioning myself differently, not outwardly, but structurally. I made copies of documents I was technically allowed to access. I reviewed agreements I had signed years earlier without fully considering how they could be interpreted. I learned which rules were assumptions and which were enforceable. This wasn't revenge, it was literacy. There is a kind of confidence that comes from believing someone else will handle things for you. And there is a different kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how things work. The second one is quieter and harder to take away. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not because it was secretive, but because narration invites interference. I wasn't hiding, I was simply not broadcasting. Meanwhile, everyone continued treating me the same way. Helpful, calm, peripheral. That's the part people misunderstand about preparation. It doesn't announce itself. It looks exactly like nothing. I still attended dinners. I still smiled at the right moments. I still fulfilled obligations, but I stopped volunteering solutions. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. I allowed small inefficiencies to exist. And in those inefficiencies, I learned where leverage actually lived. Leverage isn't about force, it's about dependency. Who relies on which assumptions? Which narratives hold things together? What happens if one quiet piece stops compensating for everyone else? I didn't test those questions yet, I just let them form. What surprised me most was how little resistance I encountered. No one questioned my disengagement from certain details. No one noticed I was no longer smoothing the edges. They were used to my silence. They interpreted it as stability, and that gave me cover. I also noticed how differently I moved through the world when I wasn't trying to be believed, when I wasn't rehearsing explanations in advance, when I trusted that clarity would matter more later than comfort did now. There is a particular calm that comes from knowing you don't need to convince anyone of anything yet. That calm is misread as passivity. I let them misread it, because while they were responding to the version of me they thought they understood, I was responding to the reality I had finally named, not emotionally, logistically. By the time the shape of the situation was fully visible to me, I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even angry. I was prepared. And preparation, when done quietly, feels like inevitability in hindsight. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush of triumph, no moment where I leaned back and thought, I knew it. What arrived instead was a kind of stillness, the kind that settles when uncertainty finally collapses into fact. I was sitting alone, early in the morning, when I finished tracing the last thread. The house was quiet in that way that makes every sound feel deliberate. I remember thinking, briefly, that this was how clarity must feel in other people's lives. Ordinary, almost boring. What I saw wasn't dramatic in isolation. No single transaction screamed wrongdoing. No document announced intent. But together, the pattern was unmistakable. Money hadn't just gone missing. It had been redirected, methodically, legally adjacent, structured in a way that relied heavily on the assumption that I would never look too closely, never ask at the wrong time, never press beyond reassurance. The reveal wasn't that something bad had happened. The reveal was that it had been happening because it could, because trust had been defined as non-interference, because my role had been interpreted as non-participation, because silence had been mistaken for ignorance. I didn't feel betrayed in the way movies depict betrayal. There was no heartbreak spiral, no collapse. What I felt was a quiet grief, not for the money, but for the intimacy that had been replaced with management. I realized then that the restraining order, which would come later, wasn't a spontaneous act of fear. It was a contingency, a defensive maneuver designed to preserve a narrative once questions were no longer containable. But at that moment, I wasn't thinking about outcomes. I was thinking about alignment. I checked my notes. I verified sources. I confirmed timelines. I made sure I wasn't filling gaps with emotion. Everything I kept was something that could stand without my interpretation attached to it. That mattered to me, because clarity isn't just about knowing the truth. It's about knowing it in a way that can't be dismissed as emotion. I didn't celebrate. I didn't confront. I didn't even feel particularly clever. I closed my notebook and sat there, letting the weight of it settle into my body. This was the moment where denial would have been easier, where I could have told myself it didn't matter, that relationships are complicated, that everyone makes mistakes. But mistakes don't follow patterns, and patterns don't apologize. What struck me most was how calm I felt. Not detached, resolved. Like a decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. I understood something essential then. Whatever came next could not be negotiated emotionally. The moment I acknowledged the truth privately, the dynamic changed permanently. You can't unknow structure, you can't unsee intent. And once you see it, your responsibility shifts, from preserving comfort to preserving yourself. I also understood why nothing in my behavior needed to change yet. The reveal was for me, not for performance. There was no urgency to expose, no need to confront prematurely. Exposure is loud, clarity is quiet. I knew that if I acted on emotion, I would be framed as unstable. If I reacted too quickly, I would confirm the version of me that justified exclusion in the first place. So I did the opposite. I stayed still. I let the knowledge settle into a strategy without rushing it into action. I allowed myself to grieve privately, not the relationship, but the illusion that had sustained it. That illusion had required my participation. I withdrew it. The private reveal wasn't the climax of the story. It was the point of no return. The moment where the path forward narrowed, not because options disappeared, but because only one of them allowed me to remain intact. I didn't feel powerful. I felt awake. And being awake changes what you're willing to tolerate. Once you see something clearly, the world doesn't immediately rearrange itself around that clarity. Life keeps moving. Conversations continue. People make plans assuming tomorrow will resemble yesterday. That's what made the decision point so quiet. Nothing forced my hand. No emergency. No confrontation. Just a widening gap between what I now understand and what I was still participating in. I knew there were multiple paths forward. I listed them mentally, the way I list options at work, without drama, without moral coloring. I could confront him directly, ask for explanations, demand transparency. That path promised noise, defensiveness, a version of reality where the focus would shift quickly from what happened to how I was reacting. I could say nothing and continue as before, armed with knowledge but unchanged in action. That path promised comfort in the short term, erosion in the long run. Knowledge without agency is just another burden. I could leave quietly, disentangling myself without explanation. That path promised safety, but also uncertainty. It relied on timing I didn't yet control. And then there was the irreversible option. The one that didn't rely on persuasion or permission. The one that acknowledged the system as it existed, not as I wished it were. I didn't choose immediately. I watched how often the opportunity for honest conversation passed without being taken, how easily reassurance replaced accountability, how little curiosity there was about my internal world. And I noticed something else, how prepared he already was for conflict, despite there being none. There were comments, offhand, casual, about people who overreact, about how messy things can get when emotions run high, about how important it is to protect yourself from false narratives. At the time, I hadn't connected those remarks to me. Now they sounded like a rehearsal. That's when I understood that the decision wasn't just about what I would do. It was about timing. If I spoke too soon, I would trigger defenses designed to neutralize me. If I waited too long, I would continue enabling a structure that depended on my silence. The irreversible option wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. It involved stepping into systems I had previously trusted to remain background noise. It meant accepting that once initiated, there would be no way back to the version of life I had been living. Not because it would be destroyed, but because it had never been what I thought it was. I thought about who I would become if I stayed quiet now. Not externally, but internally. I imagined carrying this knowledge indefinitely, shrinking myself to preserve peace that was already compromised. That version of me felt unfamiliar and unacceptable. The decision point arrived not as courage, but as alignment. I chose the option that required the least explanation and the most integrity, not because it would hurt less, but because it required the fewest compromises. I understood that once I stepped forward, the narrative would shift quickly, that actions would be taken to reassert control, that my calm would be reframed as a threat. But I also understood something else. I didn't need to be believed immediately. I needed to be precise. So I prepared to move, not emotionally, but structurally. I accepted that the consequences would be uncomfortable, public, and deeply disorienting, and I accepted them anyway. The decision point wasn't a moment of defiance. It was a moment of self-respect, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It simply moves. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally. Life continued at its usual pace. But internally, my movements became deliberate, measured. I stopped thinking in terms of reactions and started thinking in terms of sequence. This was the phase no one ever notices. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't change my tone or my routines in ways that would raise suspicion. Moving in silence doesn't mean disappearing. It means remaining legible while becoming unpredictable. I gathered what I was entitled to gather. Documents that already had my name on them. Records that existed whether I looked at them or not. I didn't force access. I didn't trespass boundaries that would compromise credibility later. Everything I did could withstand daylight. That mattered. I consulted professionals quietly, not for validation, but for a framework. I asked questions the way I always had. Calmly, specifically, without emotional embellishment. I wanted to understand systems, not vent about people. Each conversation added structure, timelines, options, risks. No one told me what to do. They didn't need to. Once you understand the architecture of a situation, the appropriate move becomes obvious. At home, nothing changed on the surface. We ate dinner together. We discussed plans. He spoke with the same confidence, the same assumption of continuity, and I let him, because interruption would have been interpreted as instability. Silence was still my ally. What's important to understand is that this wasn't manipulation. I wasn't setting traps. I wasn't engineering reactions. I was simply not alerting anyone to the fact that I had stopped participating in the illusion of mutuality. I began consolidating my own affairs, small things at first, making sure I could function independently if I needed to, ensuring that if access was suddenly limited, I wouldn't be disoriented. I thought about contingencies not with fear but with realism. When you've been removed from conversations long enough, you learn how quickly you could be removed from spaces too. That understanding sharpened everything. I also stopped protecting him from the natural consequences of his own omissions. If something slipped, I didn't cover for it. If a detail was missing, I didn't supply it. I allowed small gaps to exist. No one noticed yet, because the system still had momentum, and momentum can carry things forward for a long time before gravity asserts itself. I didn't feel brave. I felt grounded. There is a kind of confidence that comes from knowing you are acting in accordance with your values, even if the outcome is uncertain. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to remain coherent. Every step I took was reversible, except one, and I was careful to delay that one until everything else was in place. Moving in silence requires patience that most people don't have. It requires resisting the urge to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be validated. I didn't need validation anymore. I needed completion. By the time the final step approached, I was no longer thinking about fairness or reconciliation. I was thinking about durability, about how to exit a structure without collapsing under it. The irony is that to everyone else, I looked exactly the same. Calm, reasonable, reliable. They didn't see the movement because they had already decided I wasn't capable of it, and that was their final miscalculation. The consequences didn't arrive with impact. They arrived in confusion, small disruptions at first. Nothing anyone could point to and say this is the moment everything changed. Just delays. Questions that couldn't be answered immediately. Processes that no longer moved as smoothly as they once had. I noticed before anyone else did, because I had been the one compensating for those gaps. When I stopped quietly filling them, the system began to reveal its dependence on my invisibility. At home, it showed up as mild irritation. Things that had always just worked suddenly required attention. Details he had never needed to track himself became inconvenient. I could see the momentary flicker of annoyance when something didn't resolve itself automatically. He didn't connect it to me. Why would he? From his perspective, nothing about me had changed, but the ease he'd grown accustomed to was gone. In conversations, there were pauses where there hadn't been before. Decisions took longer. Explanations became less confident, more rehearsed. Not because the truth was surfacing, but because the structure supporting the narrative was weakening. Still no one confronted me. People rarely questioned the absence of something they never fully acknowledged. The first real consequence, though, wasn't logistical. It was psychological. I could feel the shift in how I was being assessed, not suspected, evaluated. There were subtle checks, casual questions framed as concern, invitations to discuss things I had previously been excluded from. Not out of inclusion, but reassurance. Was I okay? Had something been bothering me? Did I seem different? I answered honestly, but briefly. I was fine, just tired, nothing unusual. The truth was, I had never felt clearer. What unsettled him and others was not my behavior, but the loss of certainty around it. When someone has been predictable for a long time, unpredictability doesn't need to be loud to be threatening. It just needs to exist. I noticed how often reassurance was now being offered without being requested, how narratives were repeated more carefully, how explanations became more detailed, almost performative. That's when I knew the consequences had begun. Not in a way that could be confronted directly, but in a way that signaled awareness. Something was shifting, he just didn't know what, and that not knowing made him restless. I didn't take satisfaction in that. I observed it the way I observed everything else, without interpretation, without emotional charge, because the goal was never to unsettle him. The goal was to stop sacrificing myself to maintain a stability that wasn't mutual. Externally, life continued. We still shared space, still spoke kindly, still functioned. Internally, the narrative was diverging. He was trying to locate the problem. I was letting the truth do its work. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were cumulative. Each small disruption added weight. Each unanswered question created friction. And friction left unaddressed changes how systems move. I could sense the approach of something more decisive. A tightening. A move designed to reassert control. That's often what happens when quiet structures are threatened. The response isn't conversation, it's containment. I didn't know exactly how it would arrive, but I knew it would, and I was ready. When the attempt to fix things finally came, it was already too late. Not because I was unwilling to listen, but because what was being offered wasn't repair. It was containment, disguised as concern. It started with a shift in tone. Softer, more attentive. Questions that had never been asked before suddenly appeared, framed as care. Have you been feeling disconnected? I feel like we haven't been communicating lately. I want us to get back to how we were. There it was. How we were. A version of the relationship that only functioned because I absorbed the imbalance quietly. A stability built on my non-interference. A peace that depended on my silence. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge the framing. I let him speak the way you let someone finish a sentence when you already understand the language they're using. What he wanted was not transparency. What he wanted was predictability. He offered reassurance again. Broader this time, more detailed. Explanations without documentation. Promises without structure. All the right emotional notes played very carefully. It might have worked on the version of me who still believed reassurance was a substitute for access. But that version no longer existed. I realized then that the window for honest repair had closed long before this conversation. Not because of one decision, but because of repeated avoidance. Each missed opportunity to include me had narrowed the future options. By the time concern shows up as performance, the foundation is already compromised. I didn't argue, I didn't accuse, I didn't present evidence. Because fixing requires mutual recognition of the problem, and recognition can't be forced. I could see the panic underneath the composure. Not emotional panic, strategic panic. The kind that appears when control starts slipping and the old tools stop working. He tried different approaches, reason, affection, even subtle guilt. Reminders of our history, of my reputation as the calm one, the understanding one. All of it was aimed at restoring a role, not a relationship. And that's when I understood that nothing could be reversed. Not because I was hardened, but because I was no longer willing to participate in my own erasure. The more he tried to smooth things over, the clearer it became that his understanding of the problem was fundamentally misaligned with mine. He wanted reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere. I wanted accountability that had never been offered. Those are not compatible goals. I saw then how late-stage repair often looks like generosity, like effort, like sudden vulnerability. But timing matters. Care offered only when power feels threatened isn't care. It's a strategy. And strategies lose their effectiveness once they're visible. The conversation ended without resolution. Not angrily, just incomplete. He seemed unsettled. I seemed unchanged. What he didn't realize was that the irreversibility had nothing to do with emotion. It had to do with trust. Trust isn't broken in moments of conflict. It erodes in moments of avoidance. By the time someone is ready to talk, the other person has often already done the math. And my math was done. That night, I packed nothing. I didn't need to, because the separation that mattered had already happened internally. The attempt to fix it came too late. Not because it wasn't sincere, but because sincerity can't retroactively create inclusion. Once you see how replaceable your voice has become, you can't pretend to know it. And once you stop pretending, there is no going back. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a climax. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no moment where I laid everything out and waited for a reaction. If anything, it felt anticlimactic, quiet, contained, almost procedural. That was intentional. By the time we sat across from each other, I no longer needed anything from him emotionally. Not validation, not understanding, not remorse. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to be clear. I spoke slowly, carefully. Not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because I wanted every word to land exactly where it belonged. I didn't accuse him of malice. I didn't speculate about intent. I didn't raise my voice to emphasize seriousness. I described patterns. I talked about access, about decisions made without my involvement, about information withheld under the guise of protection. I spoke as someone describing a system, not a grievance. He listened at first. Then he interrupted, gently, correcting details, reframing, explaining the context I already knew. I let him finish, because this wasn't a debate. When I spoke again, I didn't counter every point. I didn't need to. I focused on one thing only: impact. I'm not asking whether you meant to, I said. I'm telling you how it functioned. That distinction unsettled him. People who rely on intent as a defense often don't know what to do when intent is removed from the equation. He tried to pull the conversation back into emotion, asked how I felt, expressed surprise that I hadn't said something sooner, framed the situation as a misunderstanding that could be talked through. I acknowledged that I could have spoken earlier. I didn't apologize for not doing so, because silence, in my case, hadn't been deception. It had been an adaptation. An adaptation has limits. I told him I wasn't interested in rehashing the past or assigning blame. I wasn't there to punish. I was there to state what would and would not continue. That was the moment the temperature changed, not because I raised it, but because I refused to manage it. There was a pause, a long one. He asked what I wanted. I told him the truth. I want my autonomy back, I said, and I don't want to negotiate for it. That was the line he couldn't cross, because autonomy, once claimed, removes leverage from explanation, persuasion, and reassurance. It doesn't argue. It doesn't defend itself. It simply exists. The conversation ended shortly after that. Not with agreement, not with closure, but with finality. I stood up. I didn't slam anything. I didn't say more than necessary. As I walked away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief. Alignment. The confrontation hadn't changed him. I hadn't expected it to. What had changed was the narrative. Quietly, irreversibly. I was no longer a participant waiting to be included. I was a person who had drawn a boundary without asking permission, and that, I knew, would reshape everything that followed. Who I am now is quieter than who I used to be, but not smaller. For a long time, I believed growth would feel like expansion, like confidence, visibility, and voice. I thought becoming stronger would mean becoming louder, more assertive, more unmistakable. It didn't. Strength arrived as subtraction. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I stopped volunteering emotional labor as proof of goodwill. I stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. What replaced those habits wasn't hardness, it was discernment. I live differently now. Not dramatically, not definitely, just deliberately. I notice how often people confuse access with entitlement, and how quickly they retreat when access is no longer automatic. I notice how systems respond when you stop compensating for their weaknesses, and I notice myself more than I ever did before. There is no bitterness in this version of me. Bitterness requires fixation. I'm no longer fixated on what should have been different. I'm interested in what is real and how to move within it without losing myself. I trust my perception now. That's the biggest change. Before I filtered everything through the question, am I overreacting? Now I ask, is this aligned with what I know to be true? That shift has made my world smaller, but clearer. Some relationships didn't survive it. Others changed shape. A few deepened in ways I didn't expect once I stopped playing the role they were comfortable with. I no longer rush to smooth discomfort. I allow silence to exist. I let pauses stretch long enough for truth to surface, or for people to reveal what they're unwilling to say. And I've learned that you don't need to perform strength for it to be real. You don't need witnesses for boundaries to hold. You don't need to be believed by everyone to be grounded in yourself. What happened to me, the removal from my own home, the paperwork, the shock of being recast as a problem for asking a question, could have hollowed me out. Instead, it clarified me. I understand now that quiet people are often seen as safe to displace because they don't make noise when they're moved. But stillness is not consent, and composure is not compliance. I am more selective with my trust. Not suspicious, but earned trust feels different than assumed trust. It has texture, mutuality, movement in both directions. I don't romanticize what I went through. There is a loss in it. There is grief. Some nights, the unfairness still arrives unannounced, but it no longer defines me. What defines me now is coherence. The feeling that my actions, my values, and my boundaries no longer contradict each other to keep the peace. I am not louder. I am no longer invisible. And I don't need dominance to prove agency. Quiet presence, when grounded in truth, is enough. There's a lesson people often want stories like this to deliver cleanly, a warning, a slogan, something easy to remember and easier to apply. But the truth is quieter than that. What happened to me wasn't the result of a single bad choice or a dramatic betrayal. It was the outcome of a pattern that went unchallenged for too long because it didn't look dangerous, because it was wrapped in calm language, good intentions, and the assumption that silence equals consent. The hardest part to accept wasn't losing my home with one bag in my hand. It wasn't the shock of being removed from a life I thought I understood. It was realizing how often I had been valued for my absence rather than my presence. For a long time, I believed being low conflict made me safe, that staying reasonable meant staying protected. I believed that if I was fair, things would eventually be fair back. What I've learned is this: systems don't reward fairness, they reward predictability. And when you are predictable in your self-erasure, people build structures that depend on it. This story isn't about blaming quiet people for being quiet. Silence can be wisdom, patience can be a strength, calm can be power, but only when they are choices, not defaults forced by fear of disruption. The moment silence stops being chosen, it starts costing you. I don't tell this story to inspire outrage or to position myself as a cautionary tale. I tell it because many people, especially those who are observant, regulated, dependable, are taught that their role is to absorb, to stabilize, to wait. And no one tells them what happens when waiting becomes a lifetime posture. If there is a moral here, it's not speak up sooner, because that assumes safety where there may be none. It's not trust less, because mistrust alone doesn't protect you either. The moral is this: pay attention to who benefits from your calm and at what cost. Ask yourself whether your silence is creating space or filling gaps that others refuse to acknowledge. Ask whether the peace you're preserving is mutual or whether it relies on your constant adjustment. And if you realize one day that your clarity arrives long after others expected it, know this: late awareness is still awareness. Quiet boundaries are still boundaries. And choosing yourself doesn't require spectacle. It only requires honesty. I'm sharing this here not to close a chapter neatly, but to open a conversation that many people carry privately. So I'll leave you with this question, and I'd genuinely like to read your answers in the comments. Have you ever been valued more for how little you asked for than for who you actually were? And if so, when did you realize it?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.